Hello, and welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby, and my guest today is Timothy Redmond, Ph.D. Dr. Redmond teaches high school history, government, and critical thinking, and is an adjunct professor at Daemen College. He is a Jackson Center Fellow, the recipient of the 2019 Toby Ticktin Back Award for Excellence in Holocaust Education, and an associate director of the Human Rights Academy. He is the author of Political Tribalism in America, How Hyper-Partisanship Dumbs Down Democracy and How to Fix It. He also has a monthly newspaper column, The Examined Life, which appears in the East Aurora Advertiser. And I'm assuming that's a shout out to Socrates, or at least the title is.
Yes.
All right, Dr. Redmond, Tim,
Yes.
Timothy, how do you like to be addressed?
Tim is fine, thank you.
Okay, great. And thank you so much for being here. You have done writing on a variety of topics, but today I want to zoom in on your critical thinking education for high school, which is a dive into a Skeptical Inquirer article you wrote that was titled Highly Effective Thinkers, Critical Thinking for Kids. But before we start, there are some words that unfortunately have become kind of buzzwords like evidence-based, gold standard science and whatnot. And I think critical thinking is starting to become a buzzword, and so is skepticism. So I always like to start with definitions so people know what we're talking about. How are you defining critical thinking? And skepticism, if you want to throw that in.
Well, for me, the way that I define critical thinking in my class is I use the epistemological vigilance model where, so my definition is the earnest or honest evaluation of sources, claims, and receivers of information. And so doing that to make sure that our beliefs are justified by a large quantity of high quality evidence. So that's how I define critical thinking, and that really sets the structure actually for my entire course. I break it down into three major units where we talk about evaluating receivers, evaluating claims, and evaluating sources. And so and you can also break that down into looking at scientific thinking and the scientific process and scientific literacy, also logic and argumentation, media literacy, and then what I start with actually is that receiver part, because I think it's so important, and I think it's the one part of that model that doesn't get as much attention, which is really, you can call it psychological literacy maybe. It's the, looking at our own biases and how we process information, because you can have all the background in the scientific method and what makes a good study and a bad study, and you can have all the training in media literacy that you want, but if you don't understand your own biases, that's going to affect how you interpret those scientific studies and how you engage in media literacy. And so I actually start there, and that's what a lot of my book is about too, is really coming to understand our own biases and how they affect our perception of information, our evaluation of information, our selection of the information that we actually read and see. So that's how I define critical thinking. And then for skepticism, it's really pretty much the standard definition I try to tell my students. Skepticism is sort of in the middle of cynicism and being naive or naivete. So we don't want to just believe everything that we hear without evidence, but we also don't want to just dismiss anything that has evidence on its behalf. We want to basically approach information and say, okay, I can go either way on this question. Where's the evidence? Show me the evidence. What's the evidence? And then I will, sort of on that sliding scale, right, of belief, I'll decide where I am on that scale based on the evidence that is presented to me, and that gets back into having a lot of really good evidence, the quality and quantity of evidence.
Okay, great. And it seems like those kind of align with my definition. So skepticism, evaluating the evidence before you make the decision, and then the critical thinking part is the ability to evaluate the evidence or at least vet a trusted source. And you laid a lot out there about your course, and we'll go through it quite a bit, point by point. And one of the first things that you laid out which I really appreciate, is that I always like to point out in these conversations, we can all be susceptible, right? So that no one is immune from errors in belief. And that's how you start your article, right? With your own prior susceptibility and critical thinking or kind of lack thereof. I guess you have a history of going down the JFK assassination conspiracy theory rabbit hole. It's always good to have, if you don't mind, a little personal anecdote there. It's always good to get that out there too. So, you know, something that you work through. So can you give a synopsis of what happened there? Do you mind?
Sure. So this would have been, the movie came out, I was just a freshman, just started college. So just fresh out of high school. I was
the movie you're talking about, when you say the movie, you're...
JFK, sorry, yes.
One of those Oliver
Stone's JFK. And so I was always, my junior year in high school, I had a great U.S. history teacher, and that really kindled my interest in U.S. history, and I really had an interest at that time too in the 1960s and Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was just really interested in that time period. And so when Oliver Stone's movie came out about the assassination, I went with a friend on opening night. I mean, I was so excited to go, and I didn't really know much about, I hadn't been exposed to any conspiracy theories about it. So I was really going in pretty much with, no background, no priors, so to speak. And then I just remember being completely blown away by the movie. I so impressed. I was transfixed because he's a great movie maker. And because I didn't really know much about it, I was just sort of assuming that all of this was fact, or at least things that were up for debate. And I just remember leaving the movie theater being really angry and in disbelief, and convinced that I was going to figure out what happened. I went to the bookstore and I got a copy of the Warren Commission report, and then I started buying some books about conspiracy theory books about the assassination. And so I really started to then dig into some of the literature that was out there, and that was, of course, getting me deeper and deeper in the rabbit hole. And I didn't really, it didn't become a huge part of my life or anything like that. Maybe if the internet was like it was today, maybe it would have gotten much worse, but I definitely believed that it was a conspiracy theory. And that there was, whether or not Oswald was involved, if he was, there were multiple shooters. And then I remember just coming across, it was a Peter Jennings program on television, and they were doing a program on the Kennedy assassination. And so because of my interest in it, I was watching it, and they just really completely ripped apart the movie. And for the time, they had this incredible technology that it was a computer simulation of Dealey Plaza, and it showed, the location of the car and the location of where Kennedy was sitting and where Governor Connolly was sitting and where Oswald was located. And you could get a 360 view of the car and then where Oswald was in the sniper's nest, and they traced the bullet down, and it was, perfectly lined up with where he was, and there was no magic bullet. And it was things like, in the movie, they have Kennedy and Connolly sitting right in front of each other at the same level. But in reality, Kennedy was higher, Connolly was lower, shifted a little bit inward. And so it was just all of these things that completely, Stone completely lied about in the movie. And I fell for it hook, line, and sinker because I wasn't thinking critically. And I just assumed, it felt like I was watching a documentary. And I think at that time I felt like, well, if it's about history and they're talking about these historical figures, it has to be true, right? And I didn't think that they would lie in a movie, because it seemed to me it wasn't a movie, it was more of a documentary. And so I was just foolishly thinking it was more factual. And, then I started to read literature that was talking about, it wasn't really a conspiracy. Here's all the evidence against Oswald. And it was just one thing after another. I was like, wow, lied about that. They lied about that. They made this up. And then, I started doing certain things. Like there were certain quotes in the movie, and then I was finding, because of the internet, I was finding the real interviews, like interviews that JFK did with Walter Cronkite, and they're all online. And you'd watch these interviews, and he, Stone would pluck one line out. The whole idea was Kennedy was killed because he wanted to pull the U.S. out of Vietnam if he was reelected, and so they killed him so they could stay in Vietnam. And so he shows this one part of an interview with Walter Cronkite where, he says something to the effect of, it's the South Vietnamese' war to win. But he didn't play the next line, which Kennedy said, but we shouldn't leave. I disagree with those who think we should leave. I think we need to stay there and help. And, just when you see this stuff, it's so misleading. And it was this realization for me, which I think, as you said, is really, really important, because we all can be duped. We all can be fooled. And for me, that was a wonderful experience actually to have. It was just such an eye-opening experience. And that feeling that you get when you go from being so certain about one thing to being then like, wow, I was wrong. Because that's an important feeling to hold on to, because I feel certain about other things today, but that knowledge and that experience gives me some humility in acknowledging and recognizing that I can be wrong about something else too. And that leaves me more open-minded as well as more skeptical. And as I write in the article, I wonder if I had been taught critical thinking skills in high school, if I would have responded differently to the movie, and who knows what else, in the intervening years before I really discovered critical thinking.
So after seeing the movie, at first it seems you only sought out confirming information, and then you stumbled onto this documentary that discredits the multiple theories. That's fair,
Yes.
right? So yep. I can't help but wonder, what was it in the documentary that spoke to you? So, you could have watched it and come off just discrediting it as more government propaganda or cover-up, but you didn't. Was it because they really went through all the details and they pulled out those, and then you found the specific interviews and that he had dropped important information?
That's a wonderful question. I think the part of the documentary that spoke most to me was the computer animation and how detailed it was and how it just fit with the ballistic evidence and stuff like that. And then, when they started showing some of the outright lies and inconsistencies with the movie, which had resonated with me, and I remembered parts of that movie, and then in the documentary, they were just showing that to be absolutely false. So that really, I just immediately, started to change my mind right there on the spot. I wouldn't say wholesale, but I was really, oh my gosh, wow, and really started to shift. And then, of course, I started to learn more and more and more after I started reading some of the anti-conspiracy literature. But I think probably the main reason why I was able to shift so easily was because it wasn't part of my identity. I wasn't a Kennedy conspiracy theorist. This wasn't a big part of my life. It was, something that I believed in, but it's not like I held on to that idea or theory deeply and invested a lot of time in it. It was something that I was really interested when I first saw the movie, but and then I just kind of went on with my life, and I believed it was a conspiracy, but it's not something that I gave a lot of thought to. And so because of that, I think I was very open to changing my mind. I don't want to say that I, was particularly intellectual, had this high level of intellectual humility or anything like that. I don't think I did. I just don't think I was super invested in it. And as I said before, I think maybe if the internet was around then and I really could find more information and go down these rabbit holes and find a community, you didn't go out. It was hard to find a Kennedy conspiracy community at that point, right? So I never really got deep into it. And if I did, I think it probably would have been harder to get out. I think maybe when I saw that program, I would have engaged more in disconfirmation bias and tried to discredit what they were doing. But so I think I don't want to give myself too much credit. I think I was just kind of lucky.
We'll get into your course in a second. Sorry to belabor this, but it's important to find out who disagrees with you and why. So that's something Harriet Hall told me a long time ago, and she's written about it, and other people have too. So I think that falls under something you wrote in the article, and I'll quote you, expose ourselves to opposing but fair-minded points of view. So that's where the why is most important. You can expose yourself to opposing views, so I can find all sorts of people that think the official explanation on 9/11 doesn't add up. But if you investigate why they think that, they do have evidence, but it's just bad evidence that's been refuted. So they have an opposing view, but it's not really fair-minded. And so I think that seems what happened to you is you got an opposing view that was fair-minded. So you investigated the opposing view, why, who disagrees with you and why, and that made sense to you, as you've laid it out right here anyway.
Yes.
So let's pivot. Go ahead.
I'll just say one quick point. I think, the fair-minded piece on that, Chris Bale, a psychologist, did a study where there's a lot of talk about, right, echo chambers and filter bubbles and exposing yourself to contrary points of view. And so he did a study where they took some people on Twitter and had Republicans follow some prominent Democrats and Democrats follow some prominent Republicans. And they were thinking that it would lead to like depolarization, that these people would be hearing information from the other side and maybe, hearing opposing points of view, maybe their views would become a little bit more moderate. And the opposite actually happened. Republicans became more extreme and Democrats became more extreme. And he realized that was because they were listening to very partisan voices. So they had, I don't remember exactly but it was like the Republicans had to follow Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi, and the Democrats had to follow like Donald Trump, right? And so they were hearing people from the other side, but they were real partisan voices from the other side, more extreme voices from the other side, and that made them more defensive. And so when we expose ourselves to a different point of view, I always encourage people to do it with people who are more fair-minded, that aren't going to make your blood boil, smoke come out of your ears, right? Someone that is on the other side that has different opinions, but the way that they talk about those opinions are evidence-based and reasonable. They're trying to make good faith arguments, and that is far less threatening. And so that's what I think is a really big piece of getting people to listen to other people, is having a good and a good source from the other side, and that's true for personal relationships as well. Having somebody, a friend, a family member, who you can go to and say, so what do you think about this, if they're on the opposite side of an issue, but where you can have that good conversation. I think that's such an important thing to have.
And your critical thinking course, we'll go right to it now. It's a one-semester course. What spurred you into developing the course? Was it 1,000 straws on a camel's back and then one too many, or something you were observing in the student body?
I think it was more something, a little bit in the student body, but I think it was more something I was just observing in the country and in the world. My degrees are in political science, so I come from a political science background, and I came to critical thinking. I didn't have any real. I took some courses in logic and things like that in college, but I really didn't come to critical thinking until after grad school, and I was just trying to stay up with the political science literature. And after I got out of grad school, there started, when I was in school, political science was very siloed. Didn't have a lot of connections with other departments and things like that. But then after I graduated, there started to be a lot more psychology making its way into political science, and I just found that research fascinating. And that was really the first time that I started hearing about things like confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. And to me, I was just absolutely fascinated with it, but it was great because it was also political science, and politics is just the ideal field to study that kind of thing. And right, because people have their strong partisan attachments and it completely warps the way that they think. And there's just all of this great research that was being done in political science about this stuff. And I just loved it. And I thought it was so important. And I started to incorporate it into my government classes. And kids found it really interesting because they had never heard about it. And the more and so that kind of got me into, then I started discovering just critical thinking books and authors and Skeptical Inquirer and, the whole skeptic community. And that just led to all these other fascinating things, like how critical thinking applies to ghosts and Bigfoot and, Ouija boards and all that stuff. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so great. This is so interesting. Kids would love this. And so I just started thinking, over the years, this should be a course. And I started thinking about it in my head and how I would structure it and how I would design it. And so it took years, kind of happened very organically. But I would say that it just started with me bringing some of that political research into my government class and seeing how kids responded to that. And then thinking, we need more of this, and it needs to be in one class, because there are, you do pick up little, they do some media literacy in this class and they do some scientific method in that class, but I feel like it needs to be in one class to really resonate with the kids, and so they could really see how it all fits together and how it can affect their thinking. And so I approached the curriculum council with it, and they were very supportive. It took a couple years, to develop the curriculum and get it approved and then get it into the course offering. But it's been running for 5 years now, I think, and it's been great. It's my favorite course to teach.
You kind of anticipated one of my questions, because I was wondering if you got any pushback, and I'm repeating myself here from various shows, because I asked that because some of the syllabi in high school courses, they have critical thinking in the description, right? So it's assumed that critical thinking is part of the course. It's in the description, right? Some circularity there. It's also in graduate school courses. It's just part of the description, or college courses. They just say, we implement critical thinking. I think that's where I'm thinking it's a buzzword.
Right.
But again, I think you were alluding to this. I found that the critical thinking in course descriptions is still topic or skill specific. It's still biology or how to approach this or that. It's not this broad definition that you gave it. So I'm wondering, when you approached the curriculum council, is that what you call it? Were you asked why a semester-long class in critical thinking? We do it all the time and everything?
Yeah, they did ask that question. And they also, so there was, well, don't we do this in other classes? And they brought up, in some of the English classes, we do media literacy. And my response to that was basically what you said, it's very course specific. And I used our social studies as an example. They in our curriculum, it says we're supposed to do critical thinking, and the primary way in which we do that is they look at primary sources, and we ask questions about, might this source have a bias, and what is that bias? And that's very important, right? You're evaluating sources, and you're thinking about a potential bias of the person who, is giving this speech or writing this particular piece of text. But it's so limited. And you kind of do it in passing because you have all this other content to get through. And then in science class, they're learning about controlled experiments and, randomization. But it's just, they only think about that in science. And they don't think about that maybe it also applies to the social sciences. And then, as I said, in English class, they might learn about, doing some sort of media literacy stuff, and check the source and who's the source, and check the, the author's credentials and things like that. But again, it's all just divided up, and there's little pieces in all these different courses. And I felt as though it would be much stronger if it was in one class. And I also felt that what was really lacking was what I said in the beginning, the focus on the receiver and our biases and what we bring to the process of critical thinking. And that is not being covered. And I think that's one of the most important things. And so that's why I start my class with that. But then it's just in so much greater detail. Like, you don't learn about all the cognitive biases in other classes. You might talk about confirmation bias in psychology, but psychology is an elective too, so all the kids aren't getting that either. And it's very easy to get through high school without much critical thinking training, as I would define it. It's
high school. You can get through graduate school without any.
Right, I did. Right,
we're gonna come back to that actually, because I have some questions about that I wanted to ask you. But I'm sorry to interrupt. Sorry about that. But anyway, I probably derailed you. But so the first unit and the confirmation bias and the receiver is great, right? Then the second unit, you have these seven habits of highly effective thinkers, which I thought were really important. So I don't know if you can go through those and give me just a brief summary of each. So be curious, diligent, skeptical, and humble, right? But argumentative and fair-minded. Courageous and compassionate. Yeah, go ahead.
If you could feed them to me one, so
be curious.
Okay, so be curious. That I just like to start with, and say critical thinking is about asking questions, and you just want a basic curiosity. You want to know why, and you want to know how things work and why people do what they do. And I think that's the basis and foundation. Is you want to know, you want to figure stuff out. So I encourage the kids to be curious.
And then be diligent.
For that one, we talk about critical thinking is hard work. So I give them the little example about the bat and the ball, from the cognitive reflection test.
Right, it costs $1, then, yeah, right.
Yeah, so you give it to them, and they usually give this intuitive answer, right? And then they stop to think about it. And say, that is being diligent, right? You don't go with your gut, don't go with your intuition. Don't, so much of our world today, especially online, is hurry up and feel, when I tell the kids stop and think, right? Just take a second, stop and think. It does take work to think, but the payoff can be great.
And then be skeptical.
So that, again,
we did that one sort of, but yeah.
Yeah, so what I just, looking for the evidence, Hume's maxim, I'm going to proportion my beliefs to the evidence. And I think just to belabor that point a little bit, I do really stress with the kids, because I do think they come into the class thinking critical thinking is just being critical, right? So it's going to challenge, which kids love, right? I get to challenge my teachers. I get to challenge this source. And it is of course being critical, but it's not being cynical. It's not just dismissing stuff. It's about finding the evidence and following the evidence where that leads. And so it's really important, I think, that they make that distinction between critical thinking and cynical thinking. And I think they know they're not just supposed to believe everything that they hear, although a lot of times we do that. But it's really fine-tuning that being critical skill. That's important, especially in today's world where there's such a lack of trust in institutions. Because there is so much cynicism out there, I have to spend a lot of time actually trying to build that trust by defining what makes good sources and what makes an expert. And these are, several days of conversation on these things, but trying to get them to think about the evidence and evaluate the evidence honestly.
And then be humble.
This is all about intellectual humility, which I mentioned a couple times already, but that we all can be wrong. And I actually start the course. I got this idea from Melanie Tressett King, who started her class with the 4 effect, where you give them. I have them do this little tell me about yourself on the first day, and then I tell them that my friend is kind of like a psychic and she can do these personality evaluations. And so I give them these personality evaluations, and they always rate them as very accurate. On a scale of 0 to 5, it's always around like a 4.3, 4.4, 4.5. And then, the big reveal is they all got the same one, and they have a great time with it and they laugh about it. But it's a wonderful way to start the course, because I could say, we all can be fooled. You've been fooled. And on that day, I tell them about my experience with the Kennedy conspiracy theory. I tell them about, I had an experience in college with a Ouija board, and I was like totally freaked out and thought it was real. So I share a story about how I shared an image that had been photoshopped. And, so I let them know that I have been fooled and continue to be fooled as well.
Be argumentative, but fair-minded.
Yeah, that's kind of what we were just speaking about. I think that we have to have arguments, and I tell the students this doesn't mean yelling and getting angry. I define argument. An argument as an exchange of reasons and ideas, and that's critically important to arriving at to the best that we can discern the quote truth. That we have to listen to other people, and we have to be open to hearing contrary evidence. And that's the fair-minded piece, that we not only have those conversations, but we are also open to changing our mind. And so that's what that one's about. And
then the last 2, be courageous, but be compassionate. Those probably can be lumped together, right?
Be courageous. I like that one. I think that's really important, because it's one thing. So the way that I frame this to my students, it's one thing to be a critical thinker. It's one thing to put in all that effort and be open to information and change your mind. But there's a whole other challenge to that requires a tremendous amount of courage. And that is, if you are embedded in a particular community, in a group of family, friends, and you start thinking critically and you change your mind, and now you are at odds with your group. It takes a lot of courage to be open about that and to share that with the group. It's a lot easier to maybe change your mind. You've done all the critical thinking, you've changed your mind, but you're not going to tell anyone about it because you don't want to lose your group. You don't want to be ostracized. And so that's what I mean by critical thinking takes a lot of courage. And I give some examples in class, the Daryl Davis, the African-American guy who spends time with the Klan, or Derek Black, he was this guy who was raised to be the heir apparent of the U.S. white supremacy movement, and then he left. That takes a ton of courage, to speak out in a group where everybody believes X, but you don't, and to come forward and say why you don't and share those ideas. That takes an awful lot of courage. And so that's why I included that one. And be compassionate for me it's twofold. One, you have to be compassionate to other people who, if you're engaged in critical thinking and you are, used to doing this sort of thing, and about all the cognitive biases and the logical fallacies and things like that, and maybe you're in a conversation with somebody who doesn't know that, who hasn't read the books that you have read, who hasn't listened to the podcast that you've listened to, it's not effective and it's not compassionate to sort of rub it in their face or to call out the logical fallacies that they're committing and things like that. You're just going to kind of come across as a pompous jerk. And that's not going to do anyone any good. And so I think there has to be compassion for people who aren't there yet, who maybe don't have these skills or have developed these tools yet. And then the second side of compassion is to be compassionate towards ourselves, because, I find this I'm somebody who does read a lot of books about critical thinking. I wrote a book about critical thinking. I listen to podcasts about critical thinking. I teach a course on critical thinking, and I still fail all the time because I have a human brain, and this is just how it works. And I would find myself getting frustrated at myself, for sort of making the same mistake over and over again. And I just have to extend that epistemological compassion to myself and say, well, I screwed up, but at least I caught myself, and I'll, try to be better next time, because there likely will be a next time. And so I just think we have to give ourselves, a little bit of leeway, and other people a little bit of leeway too. We're all on this journey, and we all want to try to help each other along. And the only way that you can help yourself along and help other people along is by extending compassion to all involved.
One thing I imagine comes up in your course, and you said it comes up in various courses now, I'm sure. When I was a kid, high school, even into college, and my first episode of graduate school, we had to go to the stacks to get information, right? We had to go to the library and then into the special part of the library for graduate school, right? To get the information we needed. Now it's all available at our fingertips, which I love, by the way. It made my second bout with graduate school so much easier to have access to a digital library, all right? But all this information, there's good and bad points to it, because we can get good information and bad information. So I imagine you must spend quite a bit of time on information literacy, how to discern good from weak, from bad information. That is critical thinking. Can you tell me a little bit, can you give me some tips on that? Well, how to, discern that?
Sure. Well, I start with talking about expertise, what makes an expert. It's a complicated subject, right?
Especially now.
We talk very much so, yeah.
With the denigration of expertise, right? We're going through a denigration of that.
Absolutely. And that's why I think it's important to talk about it in class. And so it gets into a conversation about, having a particular a specialized education, but also practice in a particular field. But then we talk about, the authority bias, but we also get into the fact that experts make mistakes. And so it's really about a community of experts, and it's really about community knowledge and the testing of ideas among experts and hashing that all out. And it's not so simple and straightforward, and there's not people that have all the answers, and those answers don't necessarily come quickly. So we sort of start there. And then that gets us into a conversation about where experts, publish their research. So we talk about journals and what makes a good journal, and we even talk about impact factors and how to look up an impact factor, even though that's not perfect or ideal. But and we talk about predatory journals, and it's amazing because I give the kids a list of real journals and predatory journals, and you can't tell the difference, right? I say, which ones are the good journals and which are the bad? And they all sound very, very professional and legitimate. And so we talk about having to mostly just do lateral reading. It's the best thing that you can do when you come across something is open up another tab, search the author, search the source, and read a little bit about it, right? Is this person, do they have credentials? Do they work for an institution that has some commitment to being, as rigorous as possible? Do they have a commitment to trying to find the truth? And does this journal or source, whatever it is, have a good reputation? So we do a lot with lateral reading. I teach them the SIFT method now. That's the one that I've been using. So it's a kind of stop, investigate the source. That's the sort of lateral reading. And then find, the F stands for finding basically corroboration in other sources. So if you find something in one source, are other sources, like legitimate sources, citing that. And then the T is tracing it's kind of doing more investigation, but a deeper investigation, tracing any links that are there, any studies that are cited, things like that. So that's the method that I teach them. I also do a lot with reverse image searches in class. So we practice that a lot. If you come across an image online, how do you know if it's real or fake? We do some stuff on deep fakes and how can you detect if an image or a video is a deep fake. And we do there are some software programs that are okay, but there's some people, I live in Buffalo, New York, and there's people at the University of Buffalo working on this. So I bring in some guest speakers on that as well. And they talk about some of the technology that they're developing to try to help people detect deep fakes. So we do a lot with that as well. But it's mostly, your basic, just don't read the article and try to figure it out yourself. Just engage in lateral reading and just start typing stuff in another search bar and see what you can find. I mean, I think that's the best advice. And I really thought, being younger kids who are very computer literate, they would know all this, but they really didn't. They do have to be taught this stuff, and they do have to learn how to do reverse image searches. Some of the kids know, but some of them don't. And the other piece I would just add to that is, again, the importance of having them realize their own biases. And because kids are like the rest of us, if we find some image online and it makes our side look good or the other side look bad, we'll probably accept it as true. We don't think critically. We don't do a reverse image search. Now, if it makes the other side look good and our side look bad, then we might be skeptical, and then we're going to do a reverse image search. So these kids can know how to do that. We can know how to do that, but we do it selectively. And so that's why I start with it. Know your own biases, because you really need to be testing the stuff that makes you feel good more than the stuff that makes you feel bad. And so that's what I try to really drive home with them. And we talk about media bias too, which is one of the most fascinating topics that I studied while I was in grad school as a political scientist. And is there a partisan bias in the news? And one of the things that the political science research shows on that is, for your mainstream news outlets, they're not. They don't exhibit a partisan bias, yet everybody thinks that they do. And why is that the case? It's because we bring our biases to the table. And so they study after study, they'll show Democrats and Republicans the exact same article, and Democrats will think it's biased against them, and Republicans will think it's biased against them, and they're looking at the same article. And that's because we bring our biases with us, and it affects how we perceive everything. And so we can have all the media literacy training that you can have, but you have to understand that you're probably only going to use those skills when it makes your side look bad. I'm trying to get the kids to also do it when it makes their side look good.
All right, let's jump ahead here. All right, I'm going to jump right to the end of your course, I think maybe, because this I got to imagine the kids dig into this like crazy. Mm-hmm. So in the 7th unit, is that the last unit where you talk about psychics and the paranormal and the satanic panic, and then you get into conspiracy theories, cults, and cryptids, sorry. So I imagine the kids must dig that, right? But I'm also wondering if it hasn't already happened earlier in the semester. I'm thinking that this unit might specifically challenge some students' personal beliefs. So I'm wondering if you see students squirming in their seats, undergoing some physical manifestations of cognitive dissonance. And I must say, I have had physical manifestations. You feel uncomfortable sometimes. Yeah. I'm not kidding about that.
Yeah, it's I have had some kids, especially with like tarot cards and psychics, who I had a kid once whose mom was a psychic, but they were, so I don't know if I do sort of like a pre-test and a post-test,
I was going to ask about. Great, okay.
Yeah, I ask them, do you believe? And I got this whole list of things, but it's anonymous. So I don't know if that particular student changed their mind or not. There's usually dramatic change, though. I wouldn't say this is scientific in any way, but they're just anonymous surveys. Do you believe Bigfoot is real, or do you believe that UFOs are aliens? There's just a list of maybe 15 statements, and there's definitely a shift in belief on a lot of these too. Students believed it before the class, but they don't after. There hasn't been anything really, really dramatic. But I do, that's why I model for myself. I tell the kids I believed in the Kennedy conspiracy theory. I believed in psychics. I used a Ouija board and thought it was real. I've shared fake images, right? All of those examples that I share, I try to model to the kids that it's okay to be wrong about something and to change your mind and to be excited actually about learning that you were wrong. So I hope that helps. I hope my personality in the classroom and my relationship with the kids that makes them feel comfortable. We always talk about that we're not here to make fun of any particular person or individual or group or any belief. We're here to understand why people believe what they believe. And so we try to do this in a very respectful way. Having said all that, a lot of those topics are really fun and they really enjoy them. And so, yes, they do love Bigfoot stuff. I bring in Kenny Biddle, who is the chief paranormal investigator, Skeptical Inquirer, because that's located near my school. And he comes in and he shares these stories about, he's called to this haunted house and that haunted house, and how he sort of debunked this particular ghost story, and how he recreated certain TikTok videos of supposed haunted house, and the kids just love that stuff. So they really do enjoy talking about all of that. And the conspiracy theory stuff they find interesting. But I haven't had any, real major concerns or anything that anyone has raised. It's mostly, I think the kids are pretty responsive and positive. But
I guess everybody's,
you never know.
I guess people are hipper than I was because, I was wondering when you describe cults and stuff, when I was exposed to some of the so-called crazy cult ideas, and then you take a step back as a former Catholic and you think, wait a minute, why is it crazy there but not over here when we do kind of the same stuff? And so it was a cognitive dissonance and uncomfortable for me when I was going through that. And then now as a former Catholic, I consider myself, if I go to a Catholic funeral mass and I see the priest come out and do east, north, south incense, I mean, it's really laughable to me at this point to think, wow, some things are crazy and other things aren't. It's like, so I just thought it would come up quite a bit. Well, let me put it a different way. So there's a lot of sports heroes for kids in school, right? So do you also cover, bogus so-called alternative medicine like kinesiology and cupping and energy healing? Because a lot of sports heroes kind of go in for that stuff. And they are viewed as, for some reason, knowledgeable, I guess.
We did, I've had some students who, great athletes who actually did cupping and stuff like that. And the one student I think about, she chose to do her research project on that. And because she was really curious, she's like, "Oh, I do this, and I want to know more about this." And at the end, she was basically, in her project, she's like, "Well, yeah, it's if it has any effect, it's just placebo, basically." And so she was open-minded enough and willing enough and interested enough, right? I mean, I thought that was incredible that she was like, "Oh, I do this, and I thought it helped me in my performance, and I want to actually learn about this and see why, there's nothing to it or whatever." And so it's the kids have been great, and it may be, maybe it's the age, which is another reason why I think it's so important to have this in high school as opposed to later, because they might not be, as like what I was saying about the Kennedy assassination. I was younger and I wasn't super attached yet to any particular theory. And given the age, these kids are still sort of figuring out who they are and what they believe, and I think maybe that makes them more open to critical thinking and questioning some of these things that they might believe in, as opposed to when they're 21 or 22, maybe 5-6 years later, and they've become more committed to a particular thing. So it might have something to do with the age too.
I'm wondering if you could get your course required. It's elective right now. And the reason I say it just popped into my head, maybe it should be required, because you and I both have admitted like we made it through graduate school without really any critical thinking. I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like we've had that experience. And so you're teaching college-bound students, I assume, and we went through the experience of not getting it in as we went all the way up through. In another article I read, which was years ago, but there have been academic publications supporting this, I read that as education goes up, so too does belief in the paranormal. So education is not a complete buffer against this. And I think when I read this article, it said that, like 23% of college freshmen believe in some paranormal, up to 26% when you're a sophomore, 27% of juniors, 31% of seniors, and then like 34% of graduate students believe in 13 different paranormal iterations, right? And then if you boil it down, majority, like 67% of seniors and even more graduate students, they believe in psychic or spiritual healing, right? So that article, if I think of it, I'll link it. It was actually in Skeptical Inquirer. But so there are academic publications that document belief in the paranormal. And I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Ray Hall and Katie Dyer and critical thinking college students.
Mm-hmm.
You said you start with a pre-course survey and then you end up with a post-course survey. And then do you actually do a follow-up like 6 or 12 months later? And I'm just wondering if you say you're collecting this anonymously. I'm wondering if you're gearing up for any publication or a study based on the results of your work.
I'm not, and I don't follow up, after they leave the class. So I don't know how long the lessons they learn stick. There's just a lot with. I'd have to go through review boards and all that stuff, So this is more just for my curiosity, and I share the results with them at the end of the year, just to see what they're thinking. But I do, on your earlier point about having this kind of education, I don't want to keep repeating myself, but in grad school, I learned, I took a research methods course and it was fantastic. And I learned all these different research methods, and, I took a statistics class and learned all about polling and sampling, and had a really good handle on how to conduct a good study and how to conduct a good poll and how to interpret statistical data, but I never had that stuff about cognitive biases that I have, and how getting back to this, this idea that you could be the people who oftentimes are the most knowledgeable still are even maybe more likely to, fall for these traps of poor thinking, because you're able to, because I took a research methods class, if I come across a study that I don't like its findings, I'll be able to find a shortcoming of that study. Right? The sample wasn't large enough, or, it was this p-hacking and it's, it's barely statistically significant, or whatever, I don't like how this question was asked, it's worded in a biased manner, because I know what to look for, right? I know how to critique a study. But if that study has a conclusion that I like, I don't even look at it, right? I don't dig into the details because I'm not trying to critique it. And I think that's the key. You can have all that statistical training and the scientific method and know-how and media literacy, but unless it's grounded in that understanding that we too are biased, it can almost backfire. You have that education in critical thinking, but it can almost hurt you as a critical thinker, because you do it selectively. And that's why I think it's so important that everybody on the planet learn about our personal biases and how our identities affect what we think and we believe and the information we seek. That is just so critical. And I don't think that, I know it's not being taught in high school classes. I don't think it's being taught in a lot of college classes or graduate classes unless you're taking a particular critical thinking course or maybe a particular psychology course. And it's just an education that I just think everyone needs to have. I think it's becoming more common. Like a lot of people now know what confirmation bias is, right? It's sort of out there in the public consciousness now, and that's fantastic. But there's a lot more biases than just confirmation bias. And I wish it was a required course. I wish it was a required course, across the country. The way that we do our education system, it's, states decide what the curriculum is going to be, what courses are going to be offered and when. And it's more expensive. If it was a required class, I teach one of these a semester. If it was a required class, I'd be teaching 5 of them a semester. And then you're going to have to hire somebody else to teach all the other classes that I do teach. And that's expensive. So it's hard. And the school day is already so full, with all the classes that kids have to do. It's really hard. It's not an easy solution. And as an educator, I understand that. To just say, well, let's just teach it. There's a lot of hurdles to clear, unfortunately, but I do advocate for it, and I do think it should be taught.
All right, we're running up against the clock here, so I got to ask you, though, what's the response been from other teachers? So do teachers come up to you and covertly kind of tell you, like, wow, your critical thinking course, it's made my course a nightmare because they're questioning everything I do? Or do they say, oh, this has been great because think back to high school, you never challenged your teachers on anything. And even up through, I didn't start challenging teachers until, except for being a jerk. I didn't really challenge them academically until I got into my second graduate school, and I thought there were some kind of funny things going on. But what do your teachers say?
Well, first of all, I can never imagine you being a jerk. I can.
Well, as a college kid, it's easy. You think you know it all, right?
Yeah. I haven't had any teachers say that to me. It's all been positive.
Good. Okay.
I've had a lot of teachers who have kids in the school who have taken the course, and they've come up to me and are like, this is all they want to talk about at dinner. They just talk about, oh, we learned about this in class, and this in class, and this in class. And there's been conversations I've had with parents that they're having, at dinner that night, they just constantly talk about what they learned in the critical thinking class. Or they would say things like, if their parents mentioned something, they would say, well, I don't know if that's true. Did you fact check that? Or, they would share something online and be like, I don't know, did you reverse image search this? And so the parents were learning those skills as well. And there's one story that I share in the article, which I'll just reiterate here, that I really loved. So this was during the class, and it was spring break, and a kid went down to Florida, and they came back, and they were so excited. They ran into the classroom, and like, Dr. Redmond, I got to tell you this story. We were walking down the boardwalk, and somebody tried selling me a magic crystal, and her mom was kind of interested. It was like, oh, and was watching. They were demonstrating this. And the daughter was like, no, thank you, and just kind of grabbed her mom and moved along. And she's like, Mom, that's just the idiomotor effect. And then she explained to her mom what the idiom, and her mom's like, what is that? And like, where did you learn this, right? And so she's like, in my critical thinking class. And so it's just, you hear those stories, and it just warms my heart. It makes it so worthwhile teaching the class, because they're taking those lessons and they're seeing it affect their decision making in the real world, which really resonates with them. Because so much you often kids are like, what good is this going to do me, or when am I ever going to use this, right? And this is the class that you're going to use this every day of your life. And for them to see that in real time, it just makes them appreciate the class so much more, because they can see, like, oh, I learned this concept in class, and it, it's not a big deal, but it saved me whatever, how many, $10 or whatever that magic crystal was going to be, in a waste of my time and energy. So as a teacher, that's all you can ask for.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to sum up, actually, because I do remember I used to teach some high school kids private music lessons, and I think at one point those balance bracelets were in the kids would wear.
Right. Yeah.
So if they had taken your course, they'd know, wait a minute, I'm not going to waste my $20 on that. Or
Yeah.
I think there used to be, I don't know if they were EMF necklaces or whatever they were that people used to wear. You'd see sports heroes wearing these. So that's amazing that that real life application, and it's so great that the student came in and told you all about it too. So
Yeah, it was wonderful.
Dr. Timothy Redmond, you have been my guest here on 502 Conversations. I think this was a great conversation. Do you have a website? Or I know I will post your book. I think your article is freely available, so I'll post a link to that as well.
Sure. You can post the article. That would be great. The book, Political Tribalism in America, you could find Amazon, anywhere they sell books. I don't have a website. You could follow me on X at TJREDMO, TJ Redmo. And that's about it. Or I have a Author Central page on Amazon too.
All right, Dr. Redmond, thank you so much for being here. I highly appreciate it. I think we got a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot more we could go into. So if you ever develop your course so that you can put it online, let me know. Sounds like something I'd like to do.
I would love to, yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Brian.
You're welcome. Thank you again.